let's talk about what's going down in Colombia. Last week, one of our viewers asked us to weigh in on Colombia. And to be quite honest, I didn't feel comfortable enough to share what my thoughts were yet. I wanted to make sure I really understood what was going on the ground. And I have a pretty good idea now. But in order to really understand what's happening in Colombia today, we obviously need to go back decades and decades to put everything in historical context. So let's do it. Protests have gripped the country of Colombia, where dozens of demonstrators have been killed by the country's militarized police force. Initially, the uprisings were a response to the conservative government's proposals to implement sales taxes in the form of a VAT tax on everyday items.
I think
the tribunal's decision further angered people to come out. We're dealing with the worst government proposals in decades. People are hungry and desperate for help, not more taxes.
The reform proposed by President Ivan Duque's government would raise taxes paid by people and businesses, including the tax on basic food items that were so far exempt. It would tax middle-class pensions, utility bills, and even funerary services.
But much like the Yellow Vest movement that occurred in France just a few years ago, what's happening in Colombia right now, and the reaction to the proposed taxes was just the straw that broke the camel's back. In reality, economic anxiety was a problem in Colombia even before the pandemic hit. Right now, about 40% of the country is living in poverty. And so the coronavirus pandemic exacerbated economic anxieties that had already existed in the country of Colombia. And so a school teacher who took to the streets spoke to the New York Times and explained that this is not just about tax reform. This is about corruption, inequality, and poverty. And all of us young people are tired of it. In fact, the coronavirus pandemic has been especially hard for Colombians. Colombia is experiencing its third coronavirus surge with nearly 500 deaths a day on average over the past week, a higher per capita rate than India's. And we all know how devastating and bleak the situation currently is in India. Now, stringent pandemic lockdowns have been blamed for causing mass unemployment and throwing some 4 million people into poverty. And so as a result, President Ivan Duque's proposal to implement a VAT tax, or a better way of thinking about it is a sales tax on everyday staples, really pushed Colombians to their breaking point.
Colombia has been devastated by COVID-19, a soaring death rate that's almost reached 3,000 in the past week, and an economy buckling under the strain of lockdowns. The working poor, especially hard hit. And now this anger, sparked by a government plan to raise taxes on many everyday items, part of a bid to rebuild the economy post-COVID. But after days of protests, the move was shelved by President Ivan Duque.
Now, even though President Duque decided to rescind his ridiculous regressive taxation, people are still protesting because of the fact that the militarized police force met them with the type of brutality that they did.
But security forces' response to the demonstrations, including military helicopters seen shooting at protesters below, has only intensified anger in the streets. At least 24 people have been killed, including a 17-year-old who kicked a police officer on a motorbike, then got shot.
So dozens of people have been killed during these protests, anywhere between 24 to 28 individuals. The numbers are still unclear, but what is unquestionable is that the police are indiscriminately shooting at these demonstrators. There are extrajudicial killings at the hands of these militarized cops. And so as a result, you're seeing people galvanized by the very footage that we showed you. For instance, demonstrators now include teachers, doctors, students, members of major unions, longtime activists, and Colombians who have never before taken to the streets. And as a result, as we see in other authoritarian governments, there are members of Duque's government who are now demanding that he takes extra actions in order to squash these protesters. Several people in the political party of President Duque are asking him to declare a state of siege, which would grant him broad new powers, essentially to clamp down on these demonstrators with even more brutality and force. Now, part of the reason why Colombians or Colombia's police happen to be as militarized as they are is because the United States government decided to militarize them with weaponry, with training, in order to fight the nonsensical and failed drug war.
The United States quietly signed a deal with Colombia, its staunchest ally in the region and the biggest recipient of military aid in the hemisphere. The agreement grants the United States access to 7 Colombian military bases for 10 years.
We have received, since many years ago, really tremendous support from the United States government, consisting in technology, training, and advice in many fields, particularly in Omega Joint Task Force theater of operation. We have received during the last 5 years very important support.
Now, this is where it's important to dig into Colombia's history to really understand the current moment. Now, that video was from 2009, kind of showing how the United States was very involved in militarizing law enforcement in Colombia. But it was done under this guise of fighting the drug war, when in reality, it was a cover to destroy left-wing militia groups known as FARC, for instance. That was one of the largest militia groups at the time. Now, Colombia has experienced a decades-long civil war that began in 1964 and ended with a treaty in 2016. The treaty isn't really being honored by the right-wing Colombian government, and that's also adding to the ongoing tensions and the demonstrations that we're seeing on the streets today. After decades of an armed conflict between government forces, paramilitary groups, and guerrilla insurgencies like the Revolutionary Armed Forces in Colombia, also known as FARC, a peace deal was reached known as the Havana Peace Agreement. Cuba, in fact, brokered the deal.
Eventually, in November 2016, the parties agree on a renegotiated compromise and sign a new peace treaty. The key points in the 297-page document cover transforming FARC into a political party, opening democratic participation for the opposition, combating drug trafficking, compensating victims, and a special tribunal for gross human rights violations. But perhaps most importantly, the agreement plans to eliminate the underlying cause of the war by way of comprehensive land reform. January 2017, the end of an era is approaching in Latin America. The continent's oldest guerrilla group sets out on its final march to hand over its weapons to UN inspectors. It is a march into an uncertain future. Will the government comply with the terms of the agreement?
Now, it's important to understand that FARC, this Marxist, leftist militia group in Colombia, had one main goal, and that main goal was to overthrow capitalism. They were represented by farmers, individuals who saw how disastrous and destructive the inequality in the country was, and they wanted to boot multinational corporations out of the country, which of course was taking advantage of its natural resources for profit. The United States did not like that. And so what is typically talked about as this friendly mutual agreement between the Colombian government and this guerrilla group was really a situation in which FARC had no choice but to surrender. And by then, it's clear that the US-led efforts to destroy FARC had worked. Take a look.
When the now President Santos was appointed as Minister of Defense in 2006, he started an aggressive campaign against FARC. A new breed of generals benefited from the president's aggressive approach, generals like Leonardo Pinto.
Las FARC tienen un plan estratégico diseñado desde los años 80. Dentro de ellos era el crecimiento aproximadamente a tener 40.000 hombres, 80 frentes, algo más de 20.000 hombres en armas. La estrategia que se llevó a cabo por el señor presidente Uribe y que se mantiene todavía con el actual gobierno permitió un fortalecimiento importante de las fuerzas militares. Las FARC tenían casi 20.000 hombres y hoy en día en general en el país tienen algo así como 7.000 terroristas en armas.
The use of drones and the increase of the air bombings has depleted the guerrilla forces. On May the 23rd, a day before the third round of peace talks began, the Colombian Air Force bombed a FARC camp in the far west, killing 2 prominent commanders and 19 militiamen.
FARC was heavily reliant on the drug trade in order to make money, really. With the fall of the Soviet Union, with a lack of support from other leftist governments, FARC was really reliant on taxing drug traffickers and in some cases, yes, peasants as well, in order to have enough money to function as a guerrilla group. And so when the United States engaged in this drug war in Colombia, they did so under this false pretense of wanting to combat addiction and to help people. The global drug trade is so dangerous and so awful. They could have easily legalized and regulated drugs in the United States to disempower these cartels in Colombia, but they decided to use brute military force against FARC in order to get them to bend to their will, get them on their knees, and to agree to this peace deal with the Colombian government. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the deal, the number one priority for FARC was a redistribution of land in an effort to root out the disastrous inequality in the country. But unfortunately, it's become more and more clear that since that treaty was signed in 2016, the Colombian government has very little interest in honoring it. Following the treaty, Iván Duque, the conservative presidential candidate, won the 2018 election, and there were already red flags indicating that he had no intention of honoring the deal.
It's the day after elections in Bogotá. The conservative candidate Iván Duque is made president with 54% of the votes. And yet the 42% for the left-wing challenger Petro is a clear sign of political change. But what does Duque stand for? He hails from the business elite and represents the interests of the big landowners. Is he able or even willing to serve the greater social good and push through the reforms laid down in the peace treaty?
The new government will be set up by the far right. They're an elite who are convinced that they have a sole claim to power, and that this power allows them to skim off any profits and economic gain for themselves. We have 1 million farmers with no land, plus 7 million displaced farmers who have come to the cities, and now live in abject poverty.
Estamos hablando también de un desplazamiento casi de 7 millones de campesinos.
The larger estates, 500 hectares or more, belong to 1% of all landowners.
Y estábamos diciendo,
and this 1% owns 85% of the land in Colombia. This is the greatest inequality in all of Latin America. And this is the root of all the unfairness that you see today in everyday life.
So Colombia had an incoming right-wing government. At this point, FARC has disbanded and is completely disarmed. And they have no power to ensure that the land reforms will be enforced. So anyone with common sense could read the tea leaves.
The implementation of the peace accord is going awfully slowly. The land reform, for example, is proving extremely difficult. There's been no progress. Farmers with little or no land have not been given more land to plant crops on, as had been promised in the agreement. Plus, more than 60 of our fighters who surrendered their weapons were subsequently killed. This means that the agreement is in danger of failing.
When the peace deal was signed, I was relieved. I was convinced that the government would choose the peace. But it seems they are neither keeping their promises to the FARC nor to the people of Colombia. If they were genuinely interested in peace, they would have not let multinational corporations into the country. They would promote rural development and growth projects.
And as the years go by, 2016 was a while ago, the anger, the frustration, the tension between the Colombian government and its people grows. And many, of course, began to question whether this was a good faith effort by the government to engage in a real peace deal that included land reforms, or if it was just a way to disempower the leftist militia group known as FARC.
The war waged by the extreme right and the big landowners for 50 years enabled them to rob the farmers of 7 million hectares of land. They see this as the spoils of war, and as the victors, they refuse to hand them back. What they were ultimately interested in was to disarm or demobilize the guerrillas, as they called it, and sell the land to multinational corporations and big businesses.
And when you look at Colombia today, it's very clear that very little has changed in regard to land reforms and inequality. Inequality has continued to grow. And when you look at how multinational corporations are taking advantage of its natural resources, you get a better understanding as to why the people of Colombia are furious.
The industrialization of agriculture and the exploitation of natural resources seem to enjoy absolute priority. The devastating consequences of this development are all too visible here, at the largest coal mine in South America, El Cerrejón, the giant mountain. A consortium of multinational companies from Switzerland, Britain, and Australia exports 32 million tons of coal from here every year, with over 90% destined for Europe. More than 2,000 mining and energy companies have operations in Colombia and are largely given a free hand by the government, with dramatic consequences for both local people and nature.
So when you look at the statistics, the numbers, and you understand the context of the anger that people are feeling in Colombia right now, these demonstrations make a lot more sense. It also makes a lot more sense that they're met with this militarized police force, considering all of the help that they've gotten throughout the years by its ally, the United States. Now, the top 10% of the country's earners received almost 40% of the country's income, which is 10 times what the bottom 20% earned, and that's according to the World Bank. I give you those numbers because it's important to understand that globally, it's understood that inequality is the top threat to democracy. In fact, speaking of which, there was a poll that was just commissioned by the Alliance of Democracies Foundation among 50,000 respondents in 53 countries. And they found that the single biggest cited threat to democracy is economic inequality. 64% of the respondents said that they felt inequality was the biggest threat. Now, that's in regard to domestically what is occurring within a country. But when it comes to the largest global threat to democracy, the majority of the respondents felt that the United States, not China, not Russia, but the United States posed the greatest threat to their democracy. And when you look at the U.S. involvement in Colombia and their efforts in destroying left-wing militias in an effort to protect US-based business interests and also European-based business interests, you get an understanding as to why respondents to the survey would feel that. Now, getting back to the current Colombian government and Duque, clearly there's been fallout when it comes to President Duque. His handling of the coronavirus has been disastrous. The way that he has proposed regressive taxation that would overwhelmingly hurt the poor has led to additional fallout. But there's some positive news as well. Gustavo Petro, a left-wing former mayor of Bogota and a former member of the demobilized guerrilla group, now leads in the polls. Duque, limited by law to one term, cannot run for re-election. Now, Petro really had no chance, let's say a decade ago. FARC was not popular by any means, and there was a lot of unrest as a result of the ongoing war between the paramilitary groups and FARC. But what's interesting is that Petro, in many of the interviews that I've seen, understands how U.S. involvement in the country wasn't about rooting out the actors in this drug war. It was really about implementing their own business goals and implementing their own foreign policy goals within Latin America. And the fact that he's aware of that, the fact that he understands that this system of inequality has been disastrous for democracy and disastrous for the people of Colombia is a good sign. And you really need to understand why people are taking to the streets today, where these frustrations come from, in order to, basically figure out like where the country needs to go in order to lead to real peace. It's not about one tax being rescinded. It's not about an economic proposal being forced upon the citizens of Colombia. It's really about this ongoing system of inequality that has hurt the majority of Colombians for decades and decades. Nando.
That was a remarkably thorough and excellent report. I got to say, I mean, I've spent a lot of time in Colombia. I have a ton of Colombian friends. I've been there, I don't know, 8 or 9 times maybe. I've worked there. It's a country I know well, and I have a lot of love for. But it's also it is one of the most violent countries in Latin America, and certainly that was always kind of its reputation. But the reputation for violence came, at least it was portrayed here as it was just like a dangerous place, and that there's drug trafficking, and then there's this like weird civil war that's been going on for 40 years. But as like Noam Chomsky writes about this a lot, like Colombia, as the largest recipient of U.S. military aid in Latin America, like more than all the other countries combined, also has amassed the worst human rights record from any Latin American country. And I'm not talking about like people like from the state, the militarized state, which you described so well, which is basically at least the military apparatus, essentially kind of like a vassal system of the United States' military apparatus. Just unbelievably violent. And like you said, the excuse of the Civil War and fighting the drug war and things like that often is used to target both environmentalists but also trade unionists. I remember, like, again, back to Chomsky's writing about this, like in the early 2000s when I started reading him in college. There's like a tally of like global trade unionists murdered, in any given year, right? Like it's like a statistic. Often 3/4 of the total global trade unionists murdered were in Colombia.
What?
And again, oops,
wow.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it's a remarkably unequal country. I think it's the second most unequal country in Latin America. But again, it's remarkable to see that the hegemony of the right in Colombia, I mean, which it just dominates Colombian politics again in this sort of hyper militarized way, just a very militarized society that permeates through all kinds of. You really sense it when you're there. The media, like it's just the presence of the military is very powerful and very prestigious in some ways. Like that seems to be breaking. I mean, it's the coronavirus. It really is scrambling everything all over the world, and you're seeing kind of political opportunities that were probably unthinkable just a few years ago. I mean, like again, the fact that the left might win power in Colombia, I mean, that was not in the cards just a few years ago. Like not at all.
Yeah. You're exactly right. Things are bad. There's no question about it. But it also poses this opportunity. And so I think the people of Colombia, and look, think about it, it's very similar to what we see in the United States with the narrative being completely twisted. So public support, of course, for FARC was very low because all you would hear about them is they're working with drug traffickers, they're installing landmines, they're the ones who are causing all the violence. But when you look at the statistics and just the uneven level of violence between the paramilitary groups and the guerrilla fighters, you'll understand that the narrative shared in the media was very much inaccurate. And think of the paramilitary groups as like literally law enforcement openly, transparently on a regular basis working with, I don't know, the Boogaloo Boys or whatever right-wing militia we have here in the United States, right? And Boogaloo Boys are kind of a joke compared to the paramilitary groups in Colombia, but yeah, 100%. But, you know, just to like think about it, it's just like this open, brazen war against the people of Colombia, the protesters and demonstrators that are out on the streets right now, who are just sick and tired of living under the system of inequality. They want changes, the very changes that the government had agreed to earlier. And they're not going to take this sitting down. And it's really inspiring to see that.
Yeah, no, it reminds me a lot of, we talked about Guatemala last week. It's a very similar situation in which there was this kind of armed left-wing insurgency in Guatemala, and it was framed here in the United States for forever as this kind of like, you know, menacing, you know, evil force, when the reality was that they were just being massacred left and right by the government, supported by the United States military apparatus. You know, that is kind of what has been happening in Colombia for 40 years, essentially. So it's been a remarkable thing to witness. I mean, you know, the response from the government to the protesters has not been surprising. I mean, it's just, like I said, it's a pretty militarized society in a lot of ways, and so they don't take kindly to this kind of thing, and we're seeing that now.